Hello, everyone, and welcome again to our channel. It's Christopher Shaw, and of course, my name is Matt, and I've got my colleague here, James Tiller. Today, we've got a recurring guest on. This is someone that we work with pretty much on a daily basis with his company, VeriSmart. They specialize in inventories as their main line of work, but also they do specialize in fit for human and habitation safety standards and Legionnaires, disease inspections, EPCs, and all sorts. A man of many hats, Craig. So thank you for joining us. Welcome again.
Thank you. Welcome.
So we're gonna start with Legionnaires today. I know we're doing a couple of videos on this. We'll split these into two videos for our watchers, but we're going to do Legionnaires first. The reason we wanted to do this with you, obviously, first and foremost, is because you are a specialist in this field. But it's cropped up a couple more times recently in a couple of cases and a couple of. Thankfully, there was not a concern when the checks were done, but it was raised in a potential dispute with the property recently. So we think it's probably good to make landlords aware of potential risks and responsibilities and maybe a change of habits and practices when it comes to Legionnaires. So to start off with, Craig, it is a bit of a tricky area. It's very grey. We mentioned this off camera. It's not quite as clear as we would like it to be. It's a tricky area of understanding for landlords. So what do landlords need to be aware of with Legionnaires?
Like you say, yes, it is a grey area. I think the main problem we have confusion surrounding Legionella risk assessments is because it's the individual's perception of the difference between what is a law and what is a legal responsibility or duty. So some landlords will perceive legal responsibility as something recommended or advised, but they don't see it as a law for which they could be prosecuted, and therefore they don't seem it necessary. Likewise, other landlords will perceive a legal responsibility as something they must absolutely do to protect themselves, to ensure that they are compliant with safety regs and towards their tenants. The short version is that as of this conversation, there is not a current law that states that all landlords must undertake a Legionella risk assessment when renting out a property. You know, like they have to with gas safety, EICR, EPCs, for example. That is a law that has to be done. What we tend to point landlords and agents like yourselves towards is, first of all, the Health and Safety of Work Act of 1973, which covers the tenants as, although they're not at work, it covers them in any way in a rented property. So there is a legal responsibility or duty of care to ensure tenant safety, which amongst many other things includes a risk of exposure to Legionella. So that's the first thing we point people towards. They've got a duty of care for lots of different elements of health and safety, but it does include Legionella. You can also reference, it's the Control of Substance Hazardous to Health Regulations of 2002 and the L8 Approved Code of Practice 2013. Now, they all word it slightly differently, but they're all saying the same thing. They have a legal responsibility and a duty of care to check for those things, and Legionella is one of them. So in the last 18 months alone, we've seen a huge upturn in letting agents and landlords taking out Legionella risk assessments. So we thought, oh, you know, what's going on here? That's a bit odd, because we've always done them. We've offered this service for many, many years, but all of a sudden it's just spiked. I think with some agents, they obviously are advising their landlords correctly. Look, cover yourselves at all costs. You know, it's the best way around it, because, you know, the cost up front of a Legionella risk assessment against, you know, a potential problem down the line is quite minimal. But it's worth remembering that although we're referring to the landlord as the responsible party or duty holder, also any agent managing on their behalf can be viewed in the same light should there be a prosecution. So especially under HHSRS. So it's advisable for you as an agent to cover yourselves, you know, cover your landlords and to cover your tenants. So ultimately, at the moment, what it comes down to is personal choice. It's whether somebody wants to get full protection for themselves, their properties and their tenants, or whether they'd rather save a little bit of money, because we all know they've had a lot of increased costs over the last years with the tenant fee ban and other things. But that's kind of where we are with the grey area.
So what actually goes into the risk assessment itself then, Craig, if you were instructed to do one, what would your steps be?
So if we're carrying out a Legionella risk assessment, first of all, it's important to remember it's a risk assessment. It's not a full Legionella testing. So if If, for example, there had already been a problem identified and specialist examination was required, someone would come in, they would take water samples, were taken away to a laboratory and tested. You know, that's worst case scenario. Something bad's already happened, or potentially an outbreak's happened. What we're doing as a risk assessment is we are advising you or highlighting areas that could be of concern. So the main thing we do is we test water temperatures. So we look to test hot and cold water at nearest and furthest sources from, nearest and furthest point from the source. So with a combi boiler, for example, you would do the nearest and furthest from the boiler and water stopcock tap. So that's where the cold water comes in, where the hot water is fed from. If there is a regular boiler which has an immersion tank or a different type of hot water system, then obviously the points that you measure from are different, but you're always looking to find the temperatures at the nearest and furthest points from where the source starts. Because if it's at the right temperature at the start and at the furthest point, then anywhere in the middle should be fine as well. So that's the first thing we're doing. Obviously, we're identifying the type of hot water system that you have. We are looking at the shower heads and anything that could cause water vapor. So understand with Legionella, it's a respiratory disease caused by inhaling bacteria through water vapor. So you could drink the water without any particular issue, unless you manage to choke on it and get it into your lungs. So we're looking at what could produce a vapor. So it's shower heads, hot tubs, sprinkler systems, water features, even some sorts of wash basins. They're the main areas that could cause a problem. So we record them. Are they in clean condition? Are there signs of heavy limescale, rust, any sludge, where these are the sort of things that the bacteria feeds on and can then manifest to the dangerous type of bacteria.
So what are normally the biggest risks then that you find in rental properties in particular?
So like I said, to understand Legionella, it's a bacteria that occurs naturally in most forms of water, and it's relatively harmless if it hasn't manifested. And like I say, you could drink it without any issue. The problem occurs when water has stagnated over a period of time, being left inside of a system, potentially in an empty house, or you know, the water tanks that you sometimes get in the attics. If they can feed on things like rust, limescale, or sludge, then it can manifest into the dangerous type of bacteria when exposed to those types of condition. And if inhaled, that's when it can cause Legionnaire's disease. And this can be fatal. But being a respiratory disease, it means that the water vapor containing the harmful bacteria does need to be inhaled. Like I said earlier, it wouldn't be a problem if you were drinking it. In domestic properties, like I mentioned earlier, we're looking at the shower heads, sinks, cold water storage tanks, which are usually in an attic. So we have to make sure they've got a secure lid on them, because obviously lots of debris and things can get inside of them. Sprinklers, hot tubs, all of those things can produce water vapor. If we're being honest, the risk of a Legionella outbreak in a domestic property is quite low, but by no means low enough that landlords should just ignore it. So properties that have got combi boilers, that's the best option, because they do not store any cold water in a tank format. What you may have is cold water stored in a old set of pipework where they've used to have a cylinder tank. They take the tank out, they put a combi boiler in, but the old pipework is left in. It's usually called a dead leg. And potentially, if that was left for a long period of time and then burst or whatnot, then it could be a problem with that. But generally with combi boilers, that's the best option in domestic properties. The only problem you could have there is if a boiler was faulty or not operating at the correct temperatures, then potentially, again, the bacteria could manifest.
So you obviously mentioned that when you're going out, the assessment that you're doing is not a full-blooded water test or a laboratory test. If a landlord was looking to self-assess, now we're probably going to be recommending that they document this in some way. Is it possible for landlords to self-assess their property?
Yes. So the risk assessment can be carried out by anybody who is classed as a competent person. So you don't need a qualification and you don't need a certification in order to carry out a risk assessment. Obviously, someone who does it on a regular basis, whether that's a company or an individual, they're going to be more experienced. They're going to know what to look for, and they're going to record it probably better and potentially more professional. Obviously, having an independent report on your system is always beneficial because it's non-biased. And like I say, if someone's doing this on a regular basis, they're going to produce a better risk assessment. But a landlord can do their own. If they're going to do their own, what they need to do is produce documentation which obviously accurately records temperature, any areas of risk, areas where problems could manifest. So if you've got dead legs, hoses, that sort of thing. And they need to be able to store that online so it can be recorded. And sorry, I don't mean online. Store that somewhere electronically in case it's ever needed to be recorded. It can't just be scribbled on a bit of paper. Doesn't really mean anything. So professionally recorded. You've got to remember this could potentially be a document that has to act as evidence if there was a problem down the line. So it's important, we feel, that it's done by somebody who knows what they're doing, and again, independent, but it's not essential. If there was ever a problem discovered when carrying out a Legionella risk assessment, then if the landlord's done it themselves, they need to show evidence that they've then looked at this problem and done something to remedy it. So if it was something as simple as the boiler was not producing hot water at optimum temperature, they went away, they got the boiler repaired, or they got the temperature changed, and they carried out a new LRA, and all is fine. If it's something a bit more serious, then obviously they need to ensure that full Legionella testing is carried out, and that's what we referenced earlier, where someone will come out and test the water system.
What about properties like HMOs? Do they have to be checked as part of the HMO licenses and things like that? Is that a regular thing, more regular thing, as opposed to people that maybe are just taking their own assessment or something? Is there got to be specific requirements for HMOs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I looked this up recently. So under HMO licensing, the referencing in terms of responsibility is the same as what we discussed earlier. It points to the same three areas, so the Health and Safety at Work Act and the rest, and said, you have a responsibility, you have a duty of care towards tenants. So in terms of, does it need to be done any more regularly? Not in my experience. So usually what we do is we tend to carry out Legionella risk assessments on an annual basis or between tenancies. That's what we do in most cases, unless there's a concern or an area that needs to be addressed on a more regular basis. So an example of that would be over the summer, when we had the hot weather, we couldn't get the cold water in most properties to come out at under 20 degrees, which is where it needs to be. Now, a lot of agents were thinking, oh no, we can't move tenants in. Well, that wasn't the case. The problem was, because it was so hot out, water is stored in reservoirs, tanks, all the rest of it. It was picking up that temperature. So what we would do is, usually where we'd say, okay, well, we come back in a year and do it again, we were going back 3 months later, which is kind of around this time of year, we've just finished doing a load, and obviously temperature's gone back down to where it should be. So, it was the weather conditions that were affecting it. But in terms of student properties, other things that I think some landlords do think of is, will the students be running the boiler properly? Would they know if there's a fault? Will they mess with the temperature and put it up or down? I guess with all respect to students, you could worry that they were not going to do any cleaning, and you could get loads of limescale or a bit of a rust in areas. So from that respect, you could potentially look to do it more often, but there isn't a particular need. And I don't think that under HMO licensing, there's any direct instruction to do so any more than the general one we discussed earlier.
It's good to know.
But one other thing just to mention actually regarding HMOs, with most student properties, obviously they tend to be empty for 4 to 8 weeks, something like that, between tenancies, sometimes less, sometimes more. So depending on the system they've got inside, obviously that is a time when cold water could start to stagnate. So it's always worth, if they've got combi boilers, it's just a case of flushing the system through, but with anything, it's worth getting it done when they're empty, because they've been empty for quite a while.
Would you say that maybe houses are at a greater risk than, say, flats? And if if you're in a block of flats and there's obviously a communal water system going into the block of flats, would that be the individual landlord or maybe their block manager that's responsible for that?
Yeah, so if you've got if you take high-rise flats where you've got large cooling water tanks, potentially in an attic space or in a basement, that are feeding lots of different properties, the individual landlord, they can still do their due diligence to show they've done as much as they can. But if it's being controlled by a central system, it falls under block management. They are responsible for the upkeep of that system. The landlord can only do what is under his control. And if it's a system that isn't within the flat, so if you've got a combi boiler in your flat, that's under the landlord's control because it's a boiler that he's either put in or it's within the property when he's purchased it. If it's an external system, you don't have access to that. You don't have the right to go down to the basement and start fiddling with it because it's controlled by somebody else. So in terms of flats and houses, it comes down to the system that's in there. Like we said earlier, the risk is relatively low. When you hear about these outbreaks, it tends to be in sports centres or some hotels. You hear about it quite a bit, not quite a bit, but more often in European hotels where they have an outbreak. And I think they use different types of air conditioning over there to the type that we would have in properties here. So I think it falls under the water that's used in that. But I don't think there's a bigger risk from flats to houses, other than the fact that obviously if it was a big block of flats and there was a problem, it would be going into lots of different flats, and obviously the potential for harm could be greater. So it's, to think of it from that perspective, then maybe flats are slightly more susceptible, but it's down to whatever system they have in there. And most systems have to be maintained on a regular basis. There's so much legislation in now. I would be relatively confident that in the area that we work, which is obviously in Bournemouth, there would be good maintenance levels, I would hope, in most properties. Yeah, this is more for the landlords of their individual properties, because obviously they are the duty holder and they have control of the system.
Lastly then, Craig, on this one, so I know we said it's not law, but there is a duty of care there. Are there any fines and penalties attached if a landlord was found to not showing due diligence on this particular subject?
Again, grey area. So unlike other legislations, such as so if you take EPCs, for example, you can have up to £5,000 fines for failing to produce an EPC or producing a fraudulent EPC. I don't believe there is a set one that covers specifically Legionella. What we can say is under HHSRS, you can receive fines from £5,000 to £30,000 per risk. Obviously, that's assessed by a local authority or council. But if they were coming out to evaluate the water system and there's something wrong, then they can impose those fines. So although it's not, you're definitely going to get a £10,000 fine for something to do with Legionella. If there was a problem, and the council are involved, they can look to install those sorts of fines. So you can be fined for it, but it's just not a direct set in stone. You know what you're going to get caught for. What it's probably worth remembering is, if there was a fatality due to an actual Legionnaire's breakout, fines are probably going to be the least of your worries. If you're prosecuted, the legal ramifications are probably going to be a bit more worse than a fine.
Funny story to finish off then. I actually thought of you, Craig, the other night about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I'll explain why. I do listen to everything you say, and we do obviously take on board of this, because we have to obviously implement the things you tell us into our everyday practice. And I think I put a drink next to my bed because it was a rather warm night, and there happened to be another slightly older drink in a bottle next to it, and I reached for it probably about 1:30 in the morning, took a big gulp, and it turned out I picked up the wrong one, and it was the older bottle, and it must have been week and a half there, and
stagnant water.
And I had a bit of a panic attack, I'm not going to lie. And the bit we said, it's about inhalation, that did stick with me from last time, and not about drinking it. But I still didn't sleep very well that night. I had to get plenty of other water down me, brush my teeth, and all the rest of it. But it was a pretty scary experience. So yeah. That was last week.
You would do well to to drink it and cause yourself a problem. So it's not completely impossible, because you could choke on water, or that apparently there's people with certain conditions, I don't know what it is, where they have a problem with drinking reflux, and the water enters the lungs. So it's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely.
You're still here, so
highly unlikely.
I dodged a bullet, but I did think of you. Just when you tell us these things, they do go in. Brilliant. So thanks for obviously joining us for this one. We're going to do a second video shortly about EPCs, one of our favorite topics. Never goes away, and there's always developments on that. So thanks for joining us on this one. Hopefully everyone that watched got some good information from this. If you do need to get more info, of course, we'll leave the details as always to Craig, or you can contact us here, and we'll be able to relay a message and go from there. But certainly it's something that we need to look out for and implement probably into our routines when we're reletting properties. Thank you again, Craig, and we'll catch up on the next one.
Thank you,
Craig.